Welcome to Coffee Auctions Part 1, Global History and Modern Microlot Auctions. I'm your host today. My name is Chris Kornman. I am the Lab and Education Manager at The Crown. The Crown is located at 2523 Broadway in Oakland, California. We're a lab and tasting room, as well as an event space and education center. You can read more about us online. Royal Coffee is the parent company of The Crown, family-owned and operated importer in business since 1978 in the Bay Area. And you are on our website right now. Auctioning is perhaps one of the most convoluted and least efficient ways to complete a coffee transaction, but it also happens to be one of the very first means used for trading green coffee. It persists today as the primary method for purchasing coffees from nations such as Kenya and Tanzania, and it maintains an important role in the promotion of high-quality microlots. It can also, in best-case scenarios, function as a method of discovery for roasters and producers, a means towards closer relationships through the supply chain. Before taking a stab at evaluating the success and failures of the current systems, I think a little bit of context is in order. By examining in detail the origins of our modern auctions, we can have a better understanding of the best direction to take for the future. With that in mind, I'd like to take a magnifying glass to a few pivotal moments in history. Once coffee was wrested from Yemeni commercial monopoly in the twilight of the 17th century, it quickly began sprouting up across the globe. The Dutch, who'd managed to smuggle the tree from Mocha to Malabar to Jakarta, then called Batavia, were already Europe's leading drinkers of Yemeni and Indian-grown coffees. However, it was their colonial holdings on Java that produced green coffee that first went to public auction. The year was 1711, the harvest was 894 pounds, and the winning bid was 23 2/3 stovers, about 47 cents USD per pound, according to William Euchers. The amount could be said to be worth about $20 per pound today if compared to our local consumer goods or gold value. At the time, it was roughly the same as the average daily salary for a common laborer in Western Europe. Amsterdam, joined shortly thereafter by Rotterdam, was engaged in regular auctions of Dutch coffee from Java. By 1864, the auction was held once a month in each location. Similar commodity auctions, depending on the European country in which they were held, were common and profitable. Most coffee-producing colonies employed slave labor on smallholder plots, private and government-owned plantations alike. Auctions were also the norm for purchasing coffee on site in colonial Java. But with only one bidder, the Dutch East India Trading Company, you can surmise the effect on prices. The result was a commodity somewhat short in supply, high in demand, with hardly any cost on the front end of the supply chain. It bears mentioning that despite the tone-deaf cultural oppression of the Dutch East India Company, and thereafter the Dutch government in Indonesia, an important anti-colonial novel emerged penned by Edward Does Dekker under the pseudonym Multatuli. Called Max Havelaar, or The Coffee Auctions of the Dutch East India Trading Company, the work served as a thinly veiled critical expose of the widespread abuse of power in the Dutch East Indies and a call to action for the European nation. In the 20th century, the Max Havelaar label was the first name given a fair trade certificate, and the Max Havelaar Foundation remains in Netherlands as the local fair trade member organization. Back in Europe and the United States, many early coffee houses were frequently used as auction rooms. These auctions would often be conducted by the candle, which meant that the candle of a predetermined length would be lit and the auctioned item would be sold to the highest bidder once the candle had burned out. The auctions, in addition to high tariffs and taxes, maintained an established elitism in consuming countries. If a pound of green coffee was selling at the Amsterdam Exchange for roughly the day wage of a common laborer at the time, it stands to reason that few of the common people would drink the beverage. However, as the 19th century neared its end, a number of conditions began to democratize coffee consumption, thereby making coffee more financially accessible, more readily available, and less reliant on auctions for transaction. The disestablishment of auctioning coffee can't be pinned to any single factor. The world at large, and the coffee world in particular, changed with unmatched rapidity in the late 19th and early 20th century in a multitude of ways. Coffee leaf rust obliterated production in colonial Java, as well as across much of South Asia and the Pacific. Elsewhere, global demand exploded in synchronicity with many producing countries in the Americas gaining their independence from colonists, effectively eliminating pre-existing European monopolies. As labor costs generally increased, local auctions no longer benefited the likes of the Dutch East Indies Trading Company, for example. Java held its final government auction in June of 1905. Better shipping reliability, improved warehousing, higher volumes, and more consistent supply globally The regulation and standardization of the import and export trade, and the establishment of foreign trading firms on site for procurement in producing countries all led to heavier reliance on business-to-business bids and trades rather than large open outcry auctions. An underwater telegraph wire from Brazil to Madeira connected the world's leading coffee producer to Europe, opening the information highway in 1873 to 1874, and in 1882 the New York Coffee Exchange became the loudspeaker for stabilized coffee pricing that the entire world could hear. The age of the isolated export auction was in its twilight by the time Ukers completed his encyclopedia in 1922. Import auction houses remained the norm into the modern age, however, and open outcry was the method for price discovery on the coffee C futures market contract all the way up until 2008. This soft commodities trading floor functions now as a market for paper coffee, setting global pricing benchmarks, but trading relatively little actual physical coffee. Since October of 2012, the Intercontinental Exchange has been converted to a 100% electronic platform. The value of the C market is in futures trades, a forum where money can be made or lost by speculating on market changes, and assets can be protected against fluctuations by hedging. Thus, while still a coffee auction in some regards, for most practical purposes, buying and selling real coffee is not the C market's primary function. However, the allure and thrill of gathering publicly and bidding to win on a rare coffee has never really been lost. Weekly coffee auctions still take place during and after harvest in Kenya and Tanzania. Ethiopia's ECX still uses a hybrid of open outcry trading floor and electronic trade. In each of these three countries, the vast majority and nearly all smallholder produced coffee is channeled through a government-run auction. For better or for worse, each of these countries use the auction as a means for earning the government additional money from their sale and have restricted to varying degrees the ability of producers to access a direct-to-export market. Most of you are probably familiar with Cup of Excellence. The inception of the COE program began in 1999, hosted by the Brazilian Specialty Coffee Association and funded by ITC, the International Trade Center. It was dubbed the Best of Brazil. It was the culmination of a 3-year project known as the Gourmet Coffee Project, and it took place in many countries. The auction component was still something of an afterthought, inspired by a quality competition hosted by Illy to this day, with cash prizes for producers. And Cup of Excellence hosted its first auction, the High Bid, the world's first online coffee auction, which lasted for a grueling 48 hours, was $2.60 per pound. In 2014, COE celebrated its 100th such auction, returning to Brazil for the occasion. The following year, a major leadership shakeup coincided with the organization scaling back to just 5 countries. Concerned participants, farmers, and roasters alike watched as a venerated organization seemed to implode. Internally, board members struggled to rebrand, having been slow to adapt to seismic paradigm shifts in the industry, including changing roaster demographics and the introduction of non-traditional coffees like dry processed naturals or the Gesha cultivar. Cup of Excellence, however, has bounced back since 2015, returning to most of the countries it paused and adding Peru for the first time in 2017. It looks to continue adding other countries, most recently launching pilot programs in Ethiopia and Indonesia. Ongoing auctions still gather high prices, and while Susie Spindler, one of the founding members, made mention that the auction is not sacred, current executive director of ACE, that's the Alliance for Coffee Excellence, the organization that runs the Cup of Excellence competitions, the current director, Darren Daniel, told me that he views the ACE membership now as a participation in a mission and a community. While there are numerous independent coffee auctions that we could be mentioning here where time and space no object, there's one country whose noteworthy auctions tend to command the most attention. The Specialty Coffee Association of Panama's annual Best of Panama competition predates the COE by 3 years, and in 2004 it reintroduced the world to the Gesha cultivar. Recent top prices have apexed over $1,000 per pound for winning bids on nanolots. Best of Panama auctions continue to test the limits of what roasters will pay for incomparable coffees. There are a number of basic subdivisions to the average Microlot coffee auction in places like Cup of Excellence or Best of Panama. Juror selection is an important duty. In some cases, like the Cup of Excellence, it's chosen from members who apply, and only jurors who have had at least one experience as an observer will have their points count towards average scores. In many cases, the scoring will eliminate top and bottom scores from outlier jurors as well. And Calibration is typically held by a head judge, either in advance or during the sessions. Coffee selections also take place as some form of lottery. Usually there's a submission fee, and in some cases, coffee submitters will have to be members of the organization as well. For most of the competition formats, there are a number of rounds. As an example, Cup of Excellence, they will have a national competition with national jurors in each individual country that will select the next coffees that move on to the international jury. For the international jury, 2 members selected from the national juror will move on to join that team as well. In most cases, the final round of coffees of the highest quality will typically enter into a top 10 type of scenario, and scores often will continue to elevate during that time. Samples can be secured in advance, usually in small quantities, and usually it's restricted to people that are members or planning to bid. It can be difficult to send out large quantities of these coffees as they're already relatively small lots. And then finally, the auction platform, again, typically restricted to people who have paid membership fees, who can bid on these coffees. And in most cases, it's a modern online auction that happens in real time, and then there's a timer that's typically associated with one or more of the coffees. That timer gets reset each time a new bid comes through. This is a remarkable moment in history, one in which microlots can gather astronomical prices, and as well-established, long-running, large-scale auctions seek to adapt to the modern coffee buying landscape. There are, in my estimation, 3 broad categories that have been used to justify auctioning coffee: discovery of price, quality and market preference, and the discovery of relationships. Let's dig briefly into each of these a little bit and appraise their success and value. Price discovery, in some ways, can be subjective, whether the coffee auctioning is attempting to discover a high price, the highest price possible for incredible small lots, or to discover the correct market price for bulk lots of coffee, as in state-run auctions. In either case, the discovery of price depends on the participants in the market and the transparency with which the auction and its sourcing practices are being held. Quality, too, can be subjective, depending on who's doing the evaluation, whether or not the buyers and sellers are actually actively participating in quality evaluation, and the standards that are being put in place, or the lack thereof in some cases. Relationships discovery is probably the most relevant for the small lot auctions like Cup of Excellence or Best of Panama, creating opportunities for roasters to become connected to the suppliers whose traceable coffee lots are being auctioned. For the large state auctions, relationship discovery can be impeded by the bureaucratic idiosyncrasies of a particular country, or by the lack of transparency in some cases. Auctions that function at their full potential are ones that not only discover exceptional one-time prices and unique coffees of incredible qualities, but those that allow buyers to become connected to farmers in more direct and more meaningful ways over time. The words, information, and photos in this series are my own and Royal Coffee property, but I would be remiss without citing a number of sources that I've relied upon, and thanking the publishers who gave me the opportunity to publish various articles on these topics. I've relied heavily on my texts that were published in Roast Magazine and Daily Coffee News. Lily Kubota and Nick Brown have been exceptional editors, and I really value their contributions to my writing and words. Articles on Tanzania and Kenya ran in DCN, and an article on Ethiopia in Roast Magazine. Tea and Coffee Trade Journal also published a 3-part coffee auction series, and I really appreciate their willingness to work with me there. And then lastly, Coffee, Tea and I Magazine has published a number of my articles on origins, including an updated article on Tanzania itself. In each of those articles, you can find specific citations and sources for the materials that were covered today, and you'll be provided with links to all of those articles, which are also all available on the Royal Coffee blog. You can, of course, always visit royalcoffee.com and check additional resources there, whether it's crown jewels or information on the crown itself, or our blog for further information and educational materials. And you can always come visit us at 2523 Broadway, or email us at info@royalcoffee.com, or dial the number below to get in touch. Look forward to hearing from you, and thanks for listening.